Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of our weekly Exploring the Parasha class with Rabbi Rebecca Schatz and Rabbi Matt Shapiro.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom to the legions that are listening.
Indeed. We are going to be talking about Parashat Shemot, which is both the beginning of a new book and also the first Parsha of said book.
As is always the case.
This is always the case.
Happens 5 times a year.
True, it does. That is...
Annually.
Very good. And as I wrote in the Taste of Torah, which you'll all receive, by the way, I think I've been on for the Taste of Torah approximately for the past 6 weeks.
You weren't on last week, but you were so
true.
Brilliant in the table for 5. I just had to defer to you.
There are a lot of different pieces of this parsha that could be spoken about. I mean, there's just the beginning, obviously, of the different names of the tribes and why we bring in from Breshit into Shemot those different names to make that bridge. There's obviously just the birth and the general growing up of Moshe with Shifra and Pua and with Yocheved, though we don't hear their names at the beginning, and Miriam, as well as Batya, in terms of how she takes care of him. And then there's also, the burning bush and all of those pieces. The burning bush is what I talk about in my Taste of Torah.
Oh, I was going to say we should talk about that.
But we're going to talk about a different part of this Parsha.
I'll publish my own Taste of Torah and hide it somewhere on the internet and people can look for it there.
Great.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about the part of the story where Moshe encounters an Egyptian somehow dealing harshly with another person who Moshe points out is a Hebrew, is not an Egyptian. So we're in chapter 2, and this picks up at verse 11. And I'm going to read the verses and translate them, and then Rabbi Shapiro is going to introduce the topic of our actual learning this morning. So
end of the year switcheroo.
End of the year switcheroo, indeed.
Well, not the end of the year.
Right.
Almost.
Sure. Vayehi b'yamim hahem, vayigdal Moshe, vayetze el echav. So in the days where Moshe grew up, he went out to his brothers. Vayar besiv lotam, vayar ish mitzri. And he went out... he went out to his brothers, but he saw their sivlotam. He saw their burdens, the harsh work that they were having to do. And he saw an Egyptian man, Makeh ish ivri me'echav, who hit a man who was a Hebrew. And then it says me'echav, from his brethren. So we'll unpack that in a little bit. Vayifen ko vecho, vayar ki ein ish vayach et hamitzri, vayit menehu bachol. So Moshe turned this way and that, ko vecho. I love those two words because you can kind of hear what he's doing even if you don't understand it. So he turned this way and that, and he sees that there is no person. We insert here the word around, though it just says in the Hebrew, ki ein ish, there's no person. Vayachet HaMitzri, and he hits the Egyptian. And then it says, and he buried him in the sand. So, well, actually, I'll just keep going. Okay. Vayetze bayom hasheni, and when he went out on the second day, vehine, and behold, there were two, shnei anashim ivrim, there were 2 people, both who were Hebrews, nitzim, who were kind of going up against one another, who were potentially fighting. Vayomer la rasha lama takeh re'echa. And he says to the bad one, interesting that, which one is that? Why are you hitting your neighbor, your brother, your foe, I'm sorry, not your foe, your fellow, your loved one. Vayomer, Mi samcha leish sar veshofet aleinu hal hargeni ata omer kaasher haragta et hamitzri vayira Moshe vayomer achen noda hadavar. And so he says, the bad guy, so to speak, the bad Hebrew says back to Moshe, who put you as the man to be like a man of power, a ruler and a judge over us? So who made you king, basically? Hal hargeni ata.
Like laharog. Are you going
but how do you say that in the conjugation? In the translation, it says, "Do you mean to kill me?" Hal hargeni ata. Okay.
Hale hargeni, right? Like, would you go as to
kill me?
Kill me. Yeah.
Interesting. Just like you killed the Egyptian, right? Just 2 verses ago. And Moshe realized, okay, they now know this thing that I did. So those are our 4 verses, more than usual, but you get the whole story in those 4. I'll just say that the thing that catches my attention is this word me'echav, that how does Moshe know that this Ivri is from his brethren? Moshe doesn't know that he's a Hebrew, right? For all intents and purposes, Moshe is an Egyptian because he grew up in Egypt, and in not only in just Egypt, the land, but in Pharaoh's palace. So why would he even think that he is a Hebrew? And why does he feel this energetic, maybe magnetic pull towards these Hebrews in such a way that they feel to him like brethren? Like, where does that come from? So that was my big kushia. And then the second one is just we don't focus on the second encounter as much as we do the first, but that there were these 2 Hebrews who were fighting, and that he decides one of them is worse than the other, which I just think is funny because how do you really know if they're both fighting? But Rabbi Shapiro, on to you.
Yes, Rabbi Schatz.
What was your kushia, or what are you going to bring to the table, as it were?
Well, I was just reading something actually interesting that I had never thought about before in light of this incident. So there's this book written by Rabbi Levi Meir, who was the rabbi at Cedar Sinai Medical Center for a number of years, and one of the first actually to write about Jungian psychology and Judaism.
Oh, there we go.
Which is on my bookshelf over there. And actually, I marked the heck out of that book, and then I realized only afterwards that he had actually signed it.
Oh.
It was like just passed off at Beit Shuvah one day. So it's a dear volume of mine. This is not that, but this is a book that he wrote specifically about Moses, and I was flipping through it. And he talks a lot about this incident. He says a couple of interesting things. I'll foreground the chiddush that I had never really thought about before, because what's weird about these verses, there's a few sort of pieces that provoke questions, but one of them is, if no one was around when Moses killed the Egyptian, how do these guys know about it? Right? And he presents a really, really interesting answer, which is that if there was someone around, it was the person who the Egyptian was beating. And so then what must be happening here, since that therefore was the only other person who was there, is now that person who the Egyptian was beating is now fighting the Israelite.
Ooh, very interesting.
And so therefore he is the one
he's the
who
good
is...
guy.
No, he's the bad guy.
Oh, he's the bad guy?
He's the bad guy.
Oh.
He's the one who now turns to Moses and says, you did this. Who are you to say to me I shouldn't do this? You literally killed this guy.
Wow. That's great.
And I know. So cool, right?
I really like that.
So I literally saw you do this. And this is something that you did to save me. Get out of my way. And so, I think in terms of the lens that we, occasionally remember to sometimes bring to these conversations, thinking about what it is to see violence as an option, and how we perpetrate cycles or actions that might not be that healthy, right, from people who are in positions of authority, right, that we then internalize and take on for ourselves and feel very justified in doing so, right? Like, I think about my kid, right? If my kids see me do the example in our house these days is our kids walk around with food all the time. Why do our kids walk around with food all the time?
Because you do.
Because Sarah and I do, right? We walk around with food. Stop walking around with food. Well, you guys do it, right? So this is not walking around with food. Slightly less egregious example. But I just think interesting in terms of modeling, in terms of the examples that leaders set for us, in terms of, and also interesting because like this guy doesn't know that Moses is an Israelite. So in this guy's perspective, here's just another Egyptian,
right,
who's a violent guy telling him, why are you guys fighting?
That's interesting.
Right? And he's like, why do you even care? Why do you even care what's going on here? This is what you Egyptians do, so now it's what I'm doing. But I think, as sort of a backdoor way of answering your question, because I had also never noticed, like, the pinpointing of who's the Rasha. So then through this lens, the Rasha is the person who sort of, like, internalizes that lesson, right? What is it to be Rasha? It's to not be able to differentiate or to sort of pause yourself from continuing a cycle of violence or taking on something that maybe you shouldn't. Interesting, of course, as well, that Moses is the like negative example, right? Like don't do what he does, but of course the flip side is, well, he has to do that because otherwise the story doesn't get started. So anyway, what do you think about that? All of those things.
I think I've never even imagined that those two characters could be the same person.
So great, right?
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, I really have very little to say about it other than I think it's fascinating. Yeah, I don't know how else to respond. I think it's fascinating. I mean, I think it is an interesting. They're not answering the same question, but it is an interesting way of us just thinking about, like, what is identity, right? Like, Moshe's deciding that this person is a bad guy. Moshe's deciding that he understands where he comes from, right? Like, how do we understand our identities and what of our past or that which is being modeled for us? How does that create our identity? Yeah. Interesting.
Well, and so then winding it back sort of a half step in the narrative, Rabbi Meir also talks about how, like, why does Moses kill the guy?
Yeah.
Right? Like, why couldn't he?
Because some of the commentaries that I read were like, oh, he didn't kill him. He just, like, he struggled with him enough that he was just buried in sand. And I was like, oh, that's so cute.
Yeah, that's definitely not what but as in court, why does he have to go? Like, he's an Egyptian prince. Say, stop doing that, or imprison him, or scare him away.
Yeah.
And Rabbi Meir interestingly talks about how he says the culture in the Pharaoh's palace had taught Moses to fear and revile strangers and foreigners, and to see them as lesser humans. Even though Moses had consciously chosen to identify himself as a Hebrew, the darkness that he had absorbed had to surface at some time in his life.
Whoa.
So this idea that he's been sort of immersed in this environment of hostility and violence. And when he sees something that's at odds with, right, like, he's been growing up in an environment where if you see something that you don't like, you lash out at it and you do away with it, right? Like, so if he's seen that modeled, then that's what he's going to do, which does not absolve him of the action, right? He still took the action. And I think there's some interesting pieces there in terms of, for each of us, right? What's the milieu in which we're situated? What are the forces acting upon us? How do we internalize those? What are the healthy or unhealthy ways of processing those? And to have both empathy for Moses in terms of this is sort of what he grew up with, and also saying, you can't do that.
Right. It's kind of like, not to make it super dark, but it's kind of like, when someone is abused as a child and then becomes a parent and abuses their child.
Cycle of abuse. Absolutely.
And they're, well, not necessarily even sexual, just like any kind of abuse, right? Yeah. Verbal, physical, whatever. But then the argument is, well, I don't know how else to love. It's like, okay, well, I get that you might not have had modeled good behavior, but by living in the world, you should know that hitting your kid, sexually abusing your kid, whatever, is not the way to show affection. Not the only way or the good way to show affection.
Well, we still are ultimately responsible for our own actions.
Correct.
What's interesting is what we're talking about is, there's of course the echo that folks might hear in these verses, right? That Moses sees, like, ein ish, right? And of course the teaching in Pirkei Avot, Makom she'ein ish yishtadel liot ish, right? In a place, we'll go with the traditional gender translation, right? Like, in the place where there isn't a man, strive to be a man, right? And sort of the sense there that if there's no one around to do what has to be done, do what has to be done, right? To sort of teachify it, right? The lo alecha, right? You don't have to do everything, but you got to do something, right? And so Moses looks hither and thither, and doesn't see anybody around. So he's like, oh, I got to do something. But then what does he do? He kills a guy, right? Like, is that the move, right? There's no one around to act for justice, freedom, truth, and you're going to kill somebody, right? So there's also kind of a dark undercurrent to that as well. Like, there's no one around to do the right thing, and that's the choice you make, right? And also I think we see then, like, he knows he did something wrong. Because if he didn't think he did anything wrong, he wouldn't get spooked when the Israelite says, what do you think you're doing? You just say, what do you care? It's fine. Yeah. Right? Like, he also does know he did something wrong, right? Because then he says, people know, I got to get out of here. If he didn't think he did anything wrong,
he wouldn't leave.
He wouldn't flee. He'd figure, big deal. I'm a prince. I can do
whatever I want.
I can do whatever I want. Interesting also that he can't, by the way. Right? Why is Pharaoh seeking to kill him? Right? Moses is also a prince. That's kind of weird. Never thought about that before.
But Pharaoh knows that he's not.
Does he? Even so, he's still living in the palace. He's still an Egyptian prince at this point.
Sure. But I guess what I'm saying is, like, the status is still different. Yeah. He might not know where he comes from.
Right. I could see it as equally likely that in an ancient Near Eastern context, someone who is currently residing in the palace could smite a taskmaster and not face the death penalty themselves for it. Right? Yeah. But he has to.
Abarbanel has the same question as me.
Oh. Well, it's always good to be on the same page as Abarbanel.
But interesting, completely different point. Ibn Ezra says that, so the first part of this first verse is Vayigdal Moshe vayetze el Echav, that Moshe grew up and then he went out to his brethren. And what Ibn Ezra is saying is that the brethren are the Egyptians. So the first time he goes out, he's going out to his brethren, which is the same word as brethren later on in the same verse.
Define your brethren.
Right, and that the first time it's Egyptians, and then Ibn Ezra doesn't actually comment on it the second time that it's used.
In those days, Moses grew up, and he went out to his brothers. But then that doesn't make sense. Vayir b'sivlotam, because the sivlotam has to be referring to their suffering. That doesn't really make any sense if it's connoting Egyptians, does it?
This is incomprehensible.
I agree.
This is what I actually don't know who this little type is on this edition of Mikra Gedola, but okay. It says this is incomprehensible unless Ibn Ezra thinks that one of his kinsmen refers to the attacker rather than the victim. Interesting. The commentators disagree on whether to read the Egyptians as a mistake for the Hebrews or whether Ibn Ezra referred to the Israelites who were living in Egypt as Egyptians. Neither solution is completely satisfying.
Yeah, I'm not. Meaning, like, I do think it's an interesting...
Well, I think it's an interesting drosh.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm going to cut you off. I think it's an interesting drosh because if the first Echav is brothers, but then he feels this pull towards what's happening to this Hebrew 3 words later in the verse, and then he refers to the Hebrews as brothers, it is interesting to think about how we choose those in our lives to be close to, and how people who we choose to have close in our lives at certain moments could become our enemies at other times in our lives, and vice versa. That someone who we did not particularly think that we were going to enjoy or be close to or have respect for could become someone who later on we do. We think about relationships more linearly, I think, in general, but if we stop to imagine those people who we are close to and have not been close to our whole lives, it's possible that shift does happen. So using the same word for both could imply that Moshe had a different translation of who his brothers were over the course of his life. And I really like that drosh.
No, I think that's definitely... I mean, I think there's definitely something to the shift in Moses'
I'm just excited
identity.
about this drosh now.
I can tell that.
Yeah.
It still doesn't grammatically make sense at the beginning of the verse.
Yeah, but grammar's not really my thing.
Okay.
So.
Great.
Just go on.
I didn't realize it was my thing either, but I'm glad to know it's not your thing.
It's definitely not my thing.
Do you want to get Freudian for a second? Do you want to?
Sure, we can.
Do you know Moses and monotheism?
I thought you were about to ask me, do you know Freudian?
Yeah, no. I have that
Do I know
much
what?
faith in you.
So thank you. That's so nice.
Freud, I mean, he's not the only one to talk about it, but it's sort of... You okay there? Rabbi Schatz just slammed her foot into the table by my couch.
But I didn't curse. Good job.
How you doing? What pain scale? 1 to 10.
Okay.
Where are we at?
Oh.
1 to 10.
Okay. I'm listening to you.
Where are you? Like 3?
Okay.
She's writhing.
I'm not.
She's writhing and she's turning purple.
I'm not doing that.
For those who are wondering. Freud articulates the hypothesis that Moses was actually an Egyptian. And that the
through and through?
That Moses was born an Egyptian, who basically ascribed to the monotheistic version of Egyptian religion, which was then done away with. But he was sort of clued into Egyptian monotheism and was sort of persecuted for it and left with some slaves to go sort of start a new religion. Now, I'm not saying I buy that, but in terms of your comment, in terms of who are his brethren, right, and who does he really identify with, right? And so from that point of view, if you're being really strict about it, you could make a case that the reason in this particular verse, when Moses is finally making the move, the reason that it says twice Echav and Echav is like, this is the moment when he's really starting to identify not with where he grew up, but where he is now shifting to, and would also give additional context for why Pharaoh would be seeking to kill him, because he knows Moses is like kind of going rogue at this point.
Oh, interesting.
In terms of identifying differently. So whether or not you buy that hypothesis, Freud, though the founder of psychoanalysis, was not a Bible scholar, but it's an interesting framework. I think there's definitely something to be said in terms of, look, I think there are different levels of identity formation over the course of our lives, and there are different populations who you might have never thought you would identify with, who then all of a sudden you're identifying very strongly with, right? The easiest example that comes to mind is, well, someone who has never been to or wants to go to a 12-step meeting all of a sudden realizes that they actually need to get into recovery, and then they identify very strongly with the fellowship in AA, right? So, and then all of a sudden they can't ever have imagined that would be a group of people.
Yeah.
And then maybe 10 years down the line, that's not something that serves them so much, and they move on to really identify with, right, a different kind of support network or population, or or when people move, or when people change workplaces, or when people move into a different type of family role, right? Like, there are always fluctuations in identity.
I do think it's, just to continue on these lines of Freud for a second, I do think it's interesting that part of what you're explaining can also be the different ways that we imagine family, right? Like, we might imagine when we are kids that we are going to get married to whoever we're going to get married to, and then we're going to have X number of children, and it's going to be easy, and we're going to have all those kids, and we're going to enjoy our lives, with those children. And I think more and more we are hearing stories of how, A, difficult it is to have those children, B, the numbers of times that birth / a baby being born is not what you expected or what you would have hoped for a child.
Yeah.
And in my own family story, I would have never imagined that we would have an interracial family. Like, I just never, when I was 5, 6, 7, I would have never imagined that, not because I would have ever thought it to be something bad or to bring our family, any less connection or meaning or status, so to speak, but because sometimes you can't imagine the things that you haven't been exposed to. And yet now I can't imagine not having family members who are of different races, because I can't imagine my family without those people. So when I think of my brothers and I having kids, it no longer looks as linear as married, have children who look like you, right? Like, there's a whole other subset of what family looks like to me. And I do think that that's not just naivete or ignorance. I just think that we are so used to the things that we come from and that we are exposed to, that for Moshe, this first iteration of Echav was just the brothers that he knew to call brothers. But then the second iteration was a pull towards something that he felt more deeply of, an identity and a community, that then he called them brothers.
Yeah. Grammar still doesn't make sense, but it's still a lovely drash.
Yeah. No, we're going to leave the grammar aside.
Great.
We can call Dr. Zioni Zevet and tell him that I was just as bad right now in my drash around this grammar as I was in his class, and he would he would laugh at that.
Would he?
Oh, totally.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, if anybody knows that I'm not good at grammar, it's my grammar teacher. So, yeah.
I was going to make the comment, I think, that not only does it happen sometimes, I think those shifts in identity are vital.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if I saw myself now as I saw myself when I was, or as I expected my life to be, or as I might have drawn my life up when I was 10 or 15 or 20 or even 25, I would probably be pretty...
Which was not that long ago.
For those of us who are older than 25 on this podcast, Rabbi Schatz, it was.
Older than 25.
That those are vital, right? I mean, that's developmental psychology 101, right? That in order for us to just like be people in the world, there are certain developmental shifts and roles that we have to move through. Otherwise, we're essentially in arrested development, right? And this is obviously a chain of events that, hopefully we don't all have to murder someone and then intervene in a potential murder in order to grow up. I would staunchly advocate for that. Yeah. But reading this through the lens of, leaving where you've been, going out in the world, struggling to understand why things are happening the way they are and how to make sense of them. I think it's definitely something that's happening here. It also, I said this to Rabbi Schatz earlier, so the author Joan Didion passed away earlier today, for those of you who know her work, but one of
We are recording on Thursday, just to be clear.
Thank you.
So you're going to be listening to it on Friday?
Yep. Or later. Or 25 years in the future when this is still living on.
Correct.
In the cloud.
But I just wanted to point out that the death happened today, not tomorrow.
I appreciate.
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay.
But one of her most famous lines, if not her most famous line, was the sort of pithy framing that we tell ourselves stories in order to live. That we each have a narrative, right? Like as I'm walking around, I have a narrative for like what I'm going to be doing today and what my plans are and what my week has in store and what my month has in store, and right? Mm-hmm. It's a narrative in which I am the protagonist, because it'd be weird if I was telling a story and, you know, my neighbor down the street was the protagonist. I wouldn't have very much to do with my time other than wave hello 3 times a day. Right? But I'm telling myself a story about what's happening in order to make sense of it. Yeah. But that story changes, right? That story shifts and evolves, and it has to, right? Mm-hmm. I think Rabbi Schatz has heard me reference this, and I mentioned it at a drash at the executive board meeting over a month ago. And Rabbi Schatz probably wasn't listening, and that's okay. I'm not sure anyone else was. But there was...
I remember. We were outside. It was freezing.
We were outside, and it was a lovely fall evening.
Nope.
But there are also hazards of narrative, right? If we get too wedded to one particular narrative of how the world is or the way things should be, that can be confining. Mm-hmm. Because, as we're all learning with Omicron, reality has a way of sort of continually upending our expectations. So we have to be able to adjust to that. And Moses sort of gets thrown for a loop here a couple of times.
I do think that a part of this identity piece that Rabbi Shapiro and I see quite often also comes about in conversion students, right? That they feel this pull towards Judaism, towards culture, towards the religion, towards a person, right, who might not be considered a brother, but would be considered a family member. And that's
a different Freudian thing.
Yeah, thank you. But that also is a really interesting way of framing this pull. That I know I keep calling it that. It doesn't say that in the Torah, but like the way in which Moshe then identifies himself as a Hebrew, right? All the commentators are come up with all these funny things to say, like, oh, Pharaoh told him he was a Hebrew, or Batya told him he was Hebrew. Okay, well, you're all making that up because you don't actually know that, and you're from the 11th century, so awesome that you think so, but maybe, probably not. And I think that what we're seeing, Rashbiro's laughing at me because he loves that I beat on the...
Straight talk from Rabbi Schatz and the Mefarshim. Listen here, Rashbam.
Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, they're doing exactly what we're doing right now. And just to say that...
Except without the recording device.
Incorrect. Well, they wrote it down. To say that, you know, that he must have heard from someone else that he was a Hebrew, okay, but also maybe he just felt a certain camaraderie and a certain kind of connection and a certain... I don't know, inspiration from the people around him who were acting like him, maybe even looked like him, though I think in today's day that would not be super PC, but just there is a magnetic pull to people who are like you, right? And that is something that I think he was feeling and experiencing. And I don't know, I just don't want to dismiss that. And I do think that people who choose to become Jewish, I think often, or I shouldn't say I think, I know, often relate to that kind of draw to their own Jewish identity.
Yeah, I think to ground it a little more in some of the language, I don't have anything corroborating the poll piece, but just going back to the beginning of verse 11, when it says Vayigdal Moshe, right? Like, you know, you can frame that, well, Moses grew up, but like he's moving into sort of like the next phase of his development. Although interesting, and as is often the case of a lot of our narratives about our ancestors, we hear like nothing. Right, we hear about what it was like for him, you know, right after he was born, and then he goes out and kills somebody. Right, we miss a lot of the middle. Depending on your favorite cinematic depiction, there are either very silly hairstyles and or chariot races along the way.
Sure.
But the Torah doesn't give us that, right? But we just hear, and then Moses grew up, right? And so, what does that mean? The other, just what, I was going to do a thing on water and well and Nile, but it's not technically in the verses that we're talking about. So
you can write the Taste of Char.
I'll save that for next year.
Oh, wow. Next year. Okay. All right. How should you want to close us out? You can do the bow.
I'm going to do the bow.
Yeah. I like that it's become a thing.
Whenever we stop doing this podcast, I hope that, either I'm going to get Rabbi Schatz a very nice bow, or she should get me a very nice.
Or we're just going to show up to our offices and have bows everywhere from our different listeners.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
All one of them are going to send a bunch of bows.
Bows. That's so cute.
Bows everywhere. I don't know that I have a...
Can you sit near the microphone? Robert Shapiro is now pacing, but I need him to be near the microphone.
I mean, obviously. All right. Okay. All right.
The very old Rabbi.
I know. That's what I'm telling you.
Okay, bow.
Bow it up. Bow nose. I think it's... going back to the piece that Rabbi Schatz was taken by as I was, and thinking about this story kind of through that lens of Moses helping someone who then kind of turned the tables on him, and the cycles of behavior that might perpetuate and how that plays into identity. I think it's a reminder of a challenge for each of us, right? Reflecting on where we are in terms of our own identity. I think it's fair to say that the past 2 years have held a lot of unexpected changes kind of all the way around. I was just talking to a friend earlier today, and I said to him, we are all way more than 2 years older than we were 2 years ago, right? Like a lot has happened over these past 2 years. And some of that is identity stuff, right? How we see ourselves, in relationship to other people, how we see ourselves in terms of how we respond to crisis.
Who we call our brothers,
right? Who we call family. The ways in which we see ourselves perpetuating cycles of violence and trauma, or the ways that we try to break out of those. And I think we can see these verses as a call to dive into exploring that, and to see that this is deep within the DNA of our tradition. That this sort of chain of events is what starts. The process towards freedom, and it's a good reminder and a call for each of us. So there you go.
Beautiful.
Shabbat shalom.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.